There is something happening inside your mind that no one ever prepared you for. And the most disturbing part is that you were taught to blame yourself for it long before you understood what it was. Quietly, automatically, almost without question. You wake up tired, even after sleeping. Not the kind of tired that a shower or coffee fixes. It's heavier than that, subtle, but persistent. A dull resistance already present before the day has properly begun. You sit down to work, to read, to focus, and something inside you hesitates. You know what needs to be done. You understand the task, but your mind feels slow, scattered, unwilling to fully engage. And almost immediately, a familiar explanation surfaces. Maybe I'm lazy. Maybe I've lost discipline. Maybe I just don't have the mental strength I used to. That explanation feels logical because it's everywhere. For years, the dominant narrative has been simple. If you're struggling, you should try harder. Push through. Optimize yourself. Fix your habits. Discipline your mind. And when none of that works, the conclusion seems obvious. The problem must be you. But what if that conclusion is wrong? What if your brain isn't failing at all, but responding exactly as it should to a system that quietly drains it every single day? Because what you're experiencing isn't a lack of motivation, and it isn't a character flaw, it's cognitive exhaustion, and modern life has turned it into a permanent background condition. Most people never notice when it starts. There is no dramatic collapse, no clear moment when everything changes. It arrives slowly, disguised as normal life. A little less focus here, a little more distraction there. Tasks that once felt effortless begin to require conscious effort. Decisions feel heavier than they should. Emotional reactions come faster, sharper, harder to regulate. And because the change is gradual, it becomes easy to normalize it. This is just adulthood. This is just being busy. This is just how things are now, but the effects accumulate. You read more than ever, but retain less. You consume information constantly, yet feel strangely mentally empty. You jump between tabs, messages, tasks, thoughts, never fully settling into any of them. At the end of the day, you feel exhausted without being able to explain why. You didn't lift anything heavy, you didn't run a marathon, and yet your mind feels worn down, drained, as if it has been working non-stop without rest. And, in a way, it has. To understand this properly, it helps to slow down and look at a very ordinary moment, not a dramatic one. Just a morning. You wake up and reach for your phone almost automatically. Notifications are already waiting, messages, headlines, updates. Before your feet touch the floor, your brain is processing information. None of it urgent, none of it particularly important. But each piece demands a tiny fragment of attention, a quick scan, a small decision, a moment of orientation. You get out of bed, start getting ready, and the stream continues. A podcast plays in the background. A video runs while you eat. You check something quickly and end up scrolling longer than you intended. By the time you sit down to actually focus, your brain has already spent energy filtering, responding, switching contexts. It hasn't rested. It hasn't warmed up. It has already been working. And now you're asking it to perform. So you open the document, or the email, or the task you've been avoiding, and suddenly there's resistance, a strange heaviness, a pull toward distraction. You tell yourself to concentrate. You tell yourself to stop procrastinating. You push a little harder. Sometimes it works for a few minutes, sometimes it doesn't work at all. Either way, it costs effort. That effort feels personal, like a failure of will. But it's not. It's a brain that has been active for hours without recovery. We live inside an environment that almost never allows the mind to disengage. Notifications interrupt thought. Messages fracture attention. Feeds refresh endlessly. Even moments that look like rest are often just another form of stimulation. Scrolling is not recovery. Streaming is not recovery. Background noise is not recovery. And yet, this has become the default way many people try to unwind. The brain never truly powers down. It stays alert, scanning, filtering, responding. Even when nothing urgent is happening, part of your attention remains on standby, waiting for the next input. This constant low-level vigilance doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal, but it is incredibly expensive over time. The nervous system was never designed to operate in a state of permanent readiness. It evolved for contrast, focus, followed by rest, engagement, followed by silence, effort, followed by recovery. When those contrasts disappear, the brain loses its rhythm. So it adapts, not by becoming stronger, but by becoming defensive. This is where many people become confused by their own behavior. Focus feels fragile, motivation feels inconsistent, thinking feels slower, memory feels unreliable. And because the cultural explanation is always internal, the blame turns inward. Something must be wrong with me. But what's actually happening is far more neutral than that. The brain is conserving energy. A cognitively exhausted brain doesn't seek complexity. It avoids it. It resists deep thinking. It gravitates toward shallow stimulation and familiar patterns, not because you lack discipline, but because the system is trying to protect itself from further depletion. This is why procrastination so often appears alongside mental exhaustion, not as a flaw, but as a signal. The brain delays demanding tasks because it no longer trusts that it has the resources to handle them. And the more you criticize yourself for that delay, the more energy you consume. Guilt consumes energy too. At this point, many people double down. They add productivity systems, they try new routines, they force habits, they consume motivational content, and for a short time, it might even work. Pressure creates movement, adrenaline compensates, but underneath, the deficit remains. Because effort borrows energy from the future, and eventually the bill arrives. It rarely arrives as a dramatic breakdown. More often, it shows up quietly. Chronic fatigue, irritability, brain fog, anxiety without a clear cause, a feeling that your own mind has become unreliable. You sit down to think and feel resistance before you've even begun. The brain is not broken, it is overdrawn, and no amount of willpower fixes an overdraft. What makes this especially difficult is that many people remember a time when things felt different, a time when focus came more easily, when reading didn't feel like work, when thinking felt fluid instead of heavy. The demands of life may not have been lighter, but the mental texture of everyday experience was not the same. There were pauses, empty moments, waiting without stimulation, spaces where the mind could wander, integrate, recover. Today, those spaces are almost gone. Any hint of boredom is immediately filled. Any silence is treated as something to eliminate. Without realizing it, we've trained our brains to expect constant input. The modern mind lives inside a stream that never stops. Information arrives faster than it can be integrated. Messages fracture attention. Even learning becomes another form of consumption, piling new concepts on top of an already saturated system. And because this level of stimulation becomes normal, the brain recalibrates its baseline. What once felt engaging now feels exhausting. This is why so many people describe their mental state as flat. Not sad, not depressed, just dulled. Curiosity fades, emotional highs soften, even pleasure becomes shallow. And in response, the brain seeks more stimulation, not realizing that this is exactly what deepens the exhaustion. It becomes a closed loop. Inside that loop, one belief dominates. I should be able to push through this. Productivity culture reinforces it constantly. Output is rewarded. Rest is tolerated only when it leads to more work. Discipline is praised. Sustainability is rarely discussed. And so people keep forcing themselves forward, borrowing energy from the future to meet the demands of the present. For a while, it works. Then it doesn't. And when it stops working, people don't question the system. They question themselves. At this stage, something important usually happens. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly. People begin to sense that the problem isn't a lack of effort. It's the environment their mind has been negotiating with all day, every day, without pause. If you slow the day down and look at it from the inside, the pattern becomes clearer. The day isn't one long task. It's a chain of interruptions, each one small, each one seemingly harmless. A message, a notification, a quick check, a thought that pulls attention away and then leaves behind a residue. By itself, none of these moments feels significant. Together, they create a constant cognitive tax. The brain spends energy orienting, reorienting, and reorienting again. It never settles. It never fully commits. And because this process happens beneath conscious awareness, it's easy to misinterpret the resulting fatigue. You think you're tired because you didn't sleep well, or because you didn't manage your time correctly, or because you lack discipline. You rarely consider the cumulative cost of carrying a fragmented day in your head. This is why so many people reach the evening feeling strangely depleted. They look back and think, I didn't even do that much. But mental work isn't measured by visible output. It's measured by how much attention was demanded, how often it was redirected, how little space there was for recovery. A day full of small cognitive pulls can be more exhausting than a day of sustained, focused effort. Years ago, the mental rhythm of life felt different. Not easier, necessarily, but more contained. When you focused, you focused. When you stopped, you stopped. Transitions existed. Waiting existed. Silence existed. The mind had time to finish one thought before being pulled into the next. Today, transitions are compressed, endings blur into beginnings, and the brain is asked to carry more unfinished threads than it was ever designed to hold. This is where the sense of mental clutter comes from. Not because you're thinking too much, but because nothing ever fully completes. Thoughts are interrupted, intentions are postponed. Attention is split and resplit until it becomes difficult to feel grounded in any single moment. Over time, this fragmentation erodes clarity, and clarity, when it disappears, takes something important with it. Without clarity, effort feels heavier, decisions feel riskier, thinking feels slower. The mind begins to hesitate, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks confidence in its own capacity. It has learned, through experience, that sustained focus comes at a cost it can't always afford, so it resists. This resistance is often misunderstood. It gets labeled as procrastination, laziness, lack of willpower. But in many cases, it's a protective response. The brain is signaling that the conditions are not right, that pushing harder will deepen the deficit rather than resolve it. This is why force-based solutions rarely work long-term. They extract performance without addressing recovery. They treat symptoms while ignoring the underlying load. They may increase output temporarily, but they do so by further depleting the system. Eventually, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. This is also why advice that works for a rested brain often fails for an exhausted one. Tips about discipline, habits, optimization, and productivity assume a baseline level of cognitive energy. When that baseline isn't there, the advice feels irrelevant or even insulting. You're told to do more when what you actually need is to do less, more intentionally. At some point, the focus shifts, not toward fixing yourself, but toward understanding the conditions your mind needs in order to function well. This is not about withdrawing from modern life. It's about interacting with it differently. A cognitively supportive environment reduces unnecessary stimulation. It protects attention instead of constantly demanding it. It acknowledges that the brain is a biological system with limits, not a machine that can run indefinitely. When those limits are respected, something interesting happens. Resistance softens, focus returns in small windows, thinking feels less forced. Many people notice the first improvements when they change their surroundings: fewer background inputs, fewer interruptions, more intentional boundaries around attention. The brain no longer has to spend energy filtering noise, so it conserves energy for what matters. Others notice a shift when they stop carrying everything mentally, when fewer tasks need to be remembered, tracked, or rehearsed in the mind throughout the day. External systems quietly hold information, so the brain doesn't have to. Not systems designed to squeeze out more productivity, but ones designed to reduce friction and cognitive strain. Some discover that mental exhaustion has a physiological layer beneath it. A nervous system stuck in a semi-alert state cannot think clearly, no matter how motivated the person is. When recovery is taken seriously, when the body is supported instead of ignored, clarity often returns without being forced. What all of these approaches have in common is that they don't begin with motivation. They don't demand discipline from a depleted system. They work because they respect the signals the brain is sending instead of overriding them. This is usually the moment when guessing stops, because once you understand that cognitive exhaustion isn't a personal failure, the question becomes more precise. What actually reduces cognitive load? What quietly makes it worse? Which habits restore clarity over time, and which ones only create the illusion of progress? These are not questions with universal answers. They depend on patterns, context, and trade-offs. They require paying attention to how your mind responds, not how it's supposed to respond. They require patience, because recovery is rarely immediate. It unfolds gradually, often in ways that are easy to miss unless you're looking for them. At some point, the desire to fix everything gives way to something more grounded. The desire to understand, to notice, to create conditions where clarity has a chance to emerge on its own. This is where the narrative changes. Not because the world becomes less demanding, but because you stop treating every demand as equally important. Attention becomes more selective. Effort becomes more deliberate. Rest becomes part of the system, not something postponed until collapse forces it. Mental exhaustion doesn't disappear overnight. It loosens its grip slowly. But even small shifts matter. Moments of clarity last a little longer. Resistance appears a little less often. Thinking feels less like pushing through mud and more like moving with direction. And with that comes something many people haven't felt in a long time. A quiet sense of mental stability. Not excitement, not constant motivation, just the feeling that your mind is no longer working against you. At some point, What matters isn't finding an immediate solution. It's recognizing what has been shaping the way your mind feels, thinks, and reacts every day, often without your awareness. Mental exhaustion doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in slowly, disguised as normal life, until clarity feels distant and effort feels heavier than it should. And once you see it, it becomes difficult to ignore. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something around you has been asking too much for too long. There isn't a single answer that resolves this. No universal fix. No shortcut that restores clarity overnight. Understanding cognitive load, what drains it and what supports recovery, is a process, one that unfolds gradually, often in quieter ways than we expect. Sometimes it starts with noticing patterns, sometimes with asking better questions, sometimes by giving the mind enough space to respond honestly instead of being pushed forward. This isn't the end of the conversation, it's simply the moment when the noise fades enough for the right questions to surface. And those questions tend to linger long after the video ends.